Ted received the result confirming Eva's identity on an afternoon that seemed utterly ordinary, a day just like any other at Fairmont Crest, with soft sunlight falling on neatly trimmed trees and the sound of cars gliding in and out of the compound as quietly as breathing. Yet with only a few cold lines of text on a white page, the order he had clung to for years shattered like reinforced glass hit dead center by a thrown stone. There was no room left for circular arguments, no space for the deliberate doubt he had worn as a subtle suit of armor, no gray zone where he could retreat into the comfort of not yet confirmed that he had always allowed himself to inhabit. This time, everything was cruelly sharp. His name appeared clearly on the page like a stamped sentence of fate, bound inarguably to Eva's. It was not possible, it did not say requires further testing, but instead delivered a definitive medical conclusion, cold as metal, Eva was his flesh and blood. Not a hypothesis, not an accusation, not a malicious rumor whispered at cocktail parties, but a final truth that no lawyer, no vote, no backroom agreement could bend. In the split second his eyes swept across the percentages and statistical figures, across the dry technical terms that felt like an entirely different language, Ted realized that everything he had been trying to deny all this time had been compressed into one single phrase: direct biological relationship. That phrase was like a thin blade that did not need to be swung hard to cut deep, slicing from the polished surface of the life he performed for the world straight down into the buried layers where his old mistakes lay hidden. Eva was no longer a potential mistake from the past, no longer a story yet to be verified he could dismiss as an inconvenient footnote in a file. She became the living embodiment of a decision he had made long ago, one he believed time and money had eroded into nothing. Her existence suddenly shifted from a faint scratch on his reputation into a fracture in his spine, a break that no glossy coat of power or prestige could cover. At Fairmont Crest, people were used to the idea that every secret had a price, and if you paid in the right currency, cash, influence, connections, or reputation, then sooner or later you could buy silence, or at least buy time. Negotiations behind closed doors, agreements sealed with polite smiles instead of ink, contracts drafted more to salvage honor than to protect legal rights, all of this had created a culture where truth was trimmed, edited, and if necessary, filed away in a drawer. Ted had long believed he understood these rules inside out and had often used them to keep his family and career from being tainted by malicious gossip. But the clinical report in his hand belonged to an entirely different world, a world of numbers, of DNA, of sequences of characters that did not care who he was, how much he had contributed, or how heavy his voice weighed at Fairmont Crest. This conclusion was like a silent bomb thrown into the center of the compound, not exploding with immediate noise but sending invisible ripples out through every wall, every relationship, every dinner that had once seemed peaceful. Within a few hours, even as Ted still sat motionless in his office, gripping the paper so hard the edges dug into his skin, the webs of power surrounding him were already trembling, though no one officially knew anything yet. His marriage to Nicole, which he had always seen as a solid alliance between love and strategy, now appeared before him like a suspended sentence hanging over his head, waiting to drop the moment the truth came out. The vows of long ago, the times he had assured his wife that his past had been taken care of, now echoed back at him from an empty room, exposing the fact that everything rested on a foundation already rotting through. Just imagining Nicole's eyes, the eyes of a woman who believed she understood all the dark corners of her husband's life. Being forced to confront the reality that he had once had another child and hidden it, was enough to make his chest tighten as if someone had wrapped wire around it. The judgment here was not just about marital betrayal, it was a moral sentence, a question of how far Nicole could forgive once she realized the years they had spent together were built on a deliberate act of denial. It was not only the marriage standing on the edge of collapse. The entire structure of wills and trusts set up for his children immediately tipped off balance in his mind, like an inheritance spreadsheet that had just been flooded by a variable he no longer had the right to ignore. Every clause he and his lawyers had painstakingly crafted to protect the future of the children he publicly acknowledged: education accounts, investment funds, conditions intended to ensure they would be worthy of their inheritance, now had to face the presence of Eva, the daughter whom the law and biology had just joined hands to validate. The question was no longer whether he wanted to give her a share of his estate, but whether he could refuse to give one when all the evidence declared she was his blood. Each line in the will suddenly became a sentence he was forced to reread under a new light, and Ted understood that any adjustment would trigger a chain reaction. Adding one more name to the list of heirs meant altering what everyone else received, and with that, the structure of power both within the family and within this community would inevitably shift. Caught in that whirlpool, Leslie, the woman who once believed she could control the narrative, who believed she could construct a version of the truth most favorable to herself, was suddenly pushed into the position of the most blatant liar, even if no one at Fairmont Crest had yet dared to say it out loud. Ted knew better than anyone the role she had played in how this story was told to the outside world, which words she chose, what she glossed over, which details she exaggerated or softened at the right moments. Leslie had spent years moving in the gray zones of truth, exploiting ambiguity to keep herself in the role of victim or injured party rather than accomplice. But the DNA report slammed those gray zones shut, turning every ambiguous phrase into a clear lie and every calculated silence into an act of concealment. Once this truth reached other people's ears, Leslie would not only have to face the judging looks of those who had believed the story she spun, she would also face something even more devastating: the loss of control over her own image, the one asset she had always guarded as fiercely as any fortune. Meanwhile, Eva, the epicenter of this entire earthquake, continued to move through the luxurious house like a temporary guest, a person living off the reluctant generosity of the owners. She had no idea about the tidal wave rushing toward her, no sense that each step she took on the cool stone floor was inadvertently drawing a new boundary for the villa itself. To her, this was still just a foreign space where she took care not to touch anything too deeply, not to leave a mark too clearly, as if afraid that a single scratch on a decorative object would prompt the entire world to remind her she did not belong. She still had the habit of stopping in front of the paintings on the wall but keeping a safe distance, of sitting on the sofa without ever fully letting her back rest into it, of touching the stair rail with shy fingertips instead of gripping it like someone who had a right to be there. Eva still believed she was nothing more than a stranger temporarily sheltering inside a story she had not written, doing her best to make her presence as light as a shadow so as not to disturb anything. In reality, every wall, every painting, every key in that house was quietly turning toward her, as if a new order were slowly, steadily taking shape, even if no one dared name it yet. The key to the front door, which had always been implicitly reserved for official family members, suddenly took on a different meaning in Ted's mind as he imagined a day when Eva would have her own copy, not as a guest, but as someone formally acknowledged. The family portraits hanging along the hallway, where she did not yet appear, abruptly became visible proof of an absence he had previously refused to see. He could picture the empty space where Eva's face should have been, and with that came the realization that he himself had helped carve out that emptiness by pushing her out of his official life for so many years. The DNA result did more than close every door of denial, more than cut off every detour his mind might take to rationalize. It also opened a different gateway, darker, wider, and far more dangerous than the simple question of who Eva really was. The new battle would no longer revolve around the question that had haunted and divided everyone for so long: is Eva truly Ted's daughter? Because that question lost its right to exist the moment the definitive percentage appeared on the page. From now on, the issue would not be Eva's identity, but the price each person would have to pay when this truth was laid bare before the entire Fairmont Crest community. Who had lied, who had remained silent at just the right time, who had exploited ambiguity to guard their own interests, who had built a virtuous public image on the foundation of denying one person's existence, each of them would be dragged into the light in ways no one could control. In Ted's mind, the list of people involved began to appear like links in a chain that could not be broken: himself, the man who chose to ignore the signs from the very beginning; Leslie, who bent the story to serve her own ends; the lawyers who tried to resolve things quietly by stalling and negotiating outside the courtroom; even Nicole, who, knowingly or not, had accepted living inside a safety zone built on refusal, as long as her life remained undisturbed. Each one of them had drawn some benefit from the truth being delayed, from keeping Eva in the role of an outsider. And now the price to be paid would not only be legal or financial, it would also be counted in the invisible fractures in their relationships, in broken trust, in the way each person would see themselves in the mirror from now on. Fairmont Crest, with its charity galas, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and smiles rehearsed to perfection before facing the cameras, had always seemed like the kind of place that could swallow every scandal beneath a fresh layer of gloss. But this shock was different from the earlier scandals that could be managed with a short press release and a neatly paid fine. This was about bloodlines, about a child denied, about a woman misbranded, about a web of lies that threaded together private lives and the community's public image. Once this truth was spoken aloud, it would not merely rock one family from within, it would force the leaders of Fairmont Crest to choose sides, to question the very values they had used for years to judge one another. And in the silence between the moment the paper was folded and the moment it would be forced into the view of other eyes, Ted understood that he was standing on a fragile border between two worlds, the old one, where he still had room to evade, and the new one, where every step he took would be scrutinized under the harsh light of truth. He could delay speaking, seek another legal opinion, try to calculate a safer path forward. But he could no longer do what he had done for so many years. Pretend that Eva was just a side story with no bearing on his official life. The gate had opened, without noise but with absolute resolve, and whether he was ready or not, the coming battle would not stop to ask. It posed only a single question, as cold and sharp as the numbers on the test report: among all the people who helped create this storm of lies, who would be the one to pay the highest price when the truth swept into Fairmont Crest like a tide that could not be held back? Thank you all for your loyal support and listening.